Afternoon, how are you? Well, this is Labor Day. Thomas Jefferson has got us out at 75 degrees, 42% humidity, and about 9 miles an hour wind. And today you can feel it. It feels nice, especially at this temperature. I am bombarded with all sorts of recollections about Labor Day. And if you'll bear with me, I'll try to stream together things that are hopping around in my head. In fact, as I was just saying that, I was thinking of when I was a kid, or a young adult. And there was a kid, Stevie, who was black, and we played together and we were friends and so forth. And I was one of the few people that went past high school in our neighborhood. In fact, my dad and mom and my younger brother didn't go past high school. But my brother had a DNA gift, and he ended up programming computers and so forth. So he took a different path out of the Bronx than I did. But Stevie and I were close friends. He was a great athlete. He's fun to be with. And I mentioned once before how we were at a friend's place, and the mother came to me and said that she'd appreciate it if we left, but I could come back, but not with Stevie. And years passed, and I hadn't been in touch with him, and I had moved, I think, onto the university, and I was driving through a place called West Farms, and I saw Stevie, and he didn't have his shirt on. He was working at construction, and his skin that had had this powerful glow when we were younger had this sandy look on it, and he was working. But it triggered in my mind that perhaps because he was a person of color, his choices were so much more limited than mine. So color, religion, a lot of things have played a negative factor in our labor market. And it's not lost on me. I mean, even as a young kid, the fact that I was Irish and kind of unfinished, we'll say, I think made a difference when people were talking to me. But what I found was, the longer I talked to them, the more I think I defeated the impression they had of a Bronx Irish kid, which was stronger today. I mean, now saying it says, how could you compare the slights you received compared to the outright discrimination a person like Stevie had? We also saw on the TV how people were being treated generally. And my grandfather had worked for Con Edison. He was active in their union. And I mentioned before that my dad and younger brother worked there as well. And I shaped up working in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, paid in cash for working the midnight to 8 a.m. shift. I wasn't in a union. But there's no question that the power of a corporate entity or business or entrepreneur, if they are not enlightened, absent anything restraining them, can be pretty terrible. Being a New Yorker, I first read a great deal about Teddy Roosevelt. And he had gone to Columbia, where I went to law school for a short time. But he didn't care for it and left it. And he found his way in politics. And at first he was against labor unions. But Samuel Gompers and others showed him what the conditions were like. The sweatshops where people worked, how dangerous they were. The hours that they worked. And so he thought they should be limited to 8 hours. And people thought he was betraying his patrician origins. He also was concerned about the the health of people. And there were a whole variety of progressive positions he took that were not finding comfort in the Republican Party, the party of businessmen, mostly its entire life. The party of the Federalists, the party of the president who these days is considered immune. Now, this is not irrelevant to our ongoing campaign here for president. The Republican standard bearer, while meeting with Musk, made fun of the rights of workers to insist on striking. And I think if Trump had his way, and he knows better, he would just as soon have what they call scabs work. That is to say, when a union man or woman strikes, it's an unlawful labor practice to replace them with someone else instead of negotiating. Now, let's not fool ourselves. Labor Day didn't come into being until the 1870s through the 1890s. And Grover Cleveland made it a national holiday. And when he made it a holiday, it was after 10 years earlier, 10,000 workers strong massed in New York and complained. And their complaint is one that we see has made differences in other places. That is the change of a worker from an artisan to a factory worker. The conditions were worse, the funds were less, the owners profited. I had some sense of this. I watched a man at 143rd Melissa Avenue walk in the street with a huge chunk of ice, cutting off pieces of it and selling it to people who had ice boxes for refrigerators. At one point, the Flannerys had one of those. And I wish we'd kept it. I thought it was in my youth, and I'm talking about grammar school years, I thought it was cute. And I thought it was great that my dad was the janitor of the building, because we were on the ground floor and we could go out in the alleyway and would pass for some greenery near our house. And we were right next to the elevated subway station and the fire station. And this was a sign of a middle-class neighborhood. And there were fistfights based on silly things. And some of them, the difference between being white or being in a gang or something like that. But nobody had any weapons in those days. So what I'm saying is the context when I was younger for labor was bad. And labor has diminished after having grown to the task and is now rearing its head again. Still, a man who would be President Trump disses the United Auto Workers for having a strike at Elon Musk's business. And he would still ask United Auto Workers to endorse him. Interesting. He also is busy trying to negotiate something with the Teamsters. Now, the United Auto Workers have endorsed Harris, so that may be why he felt comfortable singling out a union, but a statement against their right to organize so that they can present force to capital force, labor force to capital wealth and power. He misses the boat, because all labor, all workmen and women, they all hear what he's saying. We know of conditions in which, and I visited them, women threw themselves out of a building on fire because there was no other way out. And the doors were sealed from the outside to keep them in Lower Manhattan. Now, in my own life, I have been a labor lawyer in New York with a firm, Bloody Frieden Prasker, Feldman and Gartner. Prasker was the partner that I dealt with. Brilliant. And then I was special counsel to the Senate Labor Committee, investigating the mob ties alleged between Ray Donovan, who was the designated labor secretary, and I joined the DA's office to get evidence in a prosecution of Donovan. And then in the House side, I served on the Labor Committee, although the Republicans named it something else then. And there was a project, the American Worker Project. And it was interesting because it showed how our working men and women, when younger, are not getting the education they need, are not having the opportunities they need. And I had one incident in terms of preferring another staffer on the Labor Committee. And the reason I was told that we shouldn't hire the person is because they were overqualified and they'd be bored. I said, we'll just give them additional responsibilities if that's true. We'll be getting a much better worker than we are actually paying for. And it's something that we should consider giving him a raise. So we see it all around us. And so Labor Day, yes, it's a weekend for picnics and so forth. But on this year, shouldn't we be resting our arguments on how far short are Republicans to help the middle class and to help labor organize? Now, labor is flexing its muscles, and I think it's doing so and able to do so because the conditions and the wages and the opportunities are being withheld and not being compensated when there are these positions. And so this is a real problem, because without the middle class, which is the ballast, in my opinion, for a nation's economy, you lose the we're all in it together aspect of a nation. See, I had the impression when younger that what we were looking at was the wealthy enjoyed certain privileges for taking risks and building a nation that provided jobs. And the middle class, if you will, did those jobs. And then those who were really poor received transfer payments. So, people call it communism and socialism and so forth. It's a blended system when it works best, which is that everybody's at the table participating and taking, because they have skin in the game, what is deserving for their position. So, what can we do this year when we are facing a presidential election? It remains the case that we have to think democratic, because we have to disbelieve what they tell us. That is, when Trump and Musk and others make fun of labor, we have to trust that they really believe that. And that's close to home. I am not a billionaire, nor do I ever expect to be one. Nor could I imagine what it would be like spending all my time protecting and growing what has gone past necessity to some sort of constant state of avarice, greed, gluttony, for things that don't mean much. I mean, Holly and I today dusted off some bikes that we hadn't ridden since before the pandemic, and we took them to a bike path and we rode the bikes. It was ideal. I don't know how many buildings these people can have, or places to go, or drugs they can try, or diseases they tempt, but it doesn't make any sense to me, and perhaps that's why we have policies like this, because their best friends don't tell them to back off, to think of others. They wave the flag of America and they soil it. They tell us they want people to be respectful, and they're not. It's a brutal world that we live in. And Labor Day is a day to relax and enjoy ourselves. But tomorrow is a day closer to the most important election that any of us will face in our lifetime. When I worked on the Senate Labor Committee, I saw something I haven't seen since. The chairman of the committee was Orrin Hatch, a very conservative Republican from Utah. When he was younger and in Pennsylvania as a trial lawyer, he was more liberal. But over time, he became an active Mormon, moved to Utah, and took on a very conservative cast. The ranking minority member, when he was the chair, was Ted Kennedy. I had worked in 1980 for Ted Kennedy's presidency in New York, so I did get to know him somewhat. And I was appointed a special counsel to the Senate Labor Committee to investigate the confirmation hearings of Raymond, I don't know any mobsters, Donovan. Now, Donovan was on tape recordings in which they were discussing his relationship to the mob. And that was a question that was withheld from the Senate Labor Committee. So I was chosen to investigate that. And the first day of the Labor Committee, like any eager employee, I was there early. Ted Kennedy was in the room, sitting at the table, I think looking over the bills we were going to discuss. And he said, "Hello, John." And I said, "Hello." So then he said in a friendly way, "So what are you doing here?" Like it might be one of the bills he had in front of him. I said, "I'm special counsel to the Senate Labor Committee." So he said, "No, you're not." I said, I am. He thought I was kidding him. And he said, "Well, I didn't appoint you," because he would expect a guy like me, a visible Democrat, would not be appointed by a Republican like the current chairman from Utah. So he said to me, "I didn't appoint you." And I said, "But Orrin did, Orrin Hatch." And so he took his hand and he hit his forehead in mock, like, "Now I've seen everything." Now, that's a long story to tell the following. Senator Hatch and Senator Kennedy, at a time when Reagan was in the White House, were joined supporting different measures, particularly health measures. And so, at that time, there was a time to run for office, and there was a time to govern. And these two men genuinely cared and liked each other, even with their differences. The present candidates for office, they don't give a damn about getting along. If they have the numbers, if they have the power, they'll do whatever they want. I think an example of this is what happened at Arlington National Cemetery the other day. rules, the law, decorum, direction, all ignored, to turn it into a political staging. Now, I've stood there, as I've said before, and held a folded flag when my dad was placed in that cemetery. Also, when my father-in-law, Holly's dad, and my mom is there as well. And the decorum is what you'd expect at a special place that's dealing with a family's loss and death, and the statement of an institution that is grateful for the sacrifice they made. There are, of course, ways to object or protest to war. But Trump knows none of them, because his objective is to be seen, to be heard, to distort it, to be elected, so he can then set about the task of defeating the punishments he rightly deserves to suffer for all the things he's done. So, labor is another one of those areas we have to keep in mind when we're thinking about who should be president. Because it must be clear that Kamala and Tim know what it means. They know what it means for teachers to be able to discuss the wages and conditions of performing a public job, and even striking if necessary. But you see, when the people running for office don't believe anybody has rights except which ones they grudgingly concede, that's a very different government than what we need and what I think is evolving, because this doesn't exist now. Biden has tried, but the House and the Senate, dominated by Republicans even when we have the majority, need more. And that's up to us. So I hope that I'll see you guys tomorrow. And I say good evening from my cathedral of trees. All the best. Bye-bye.